Hello, my friends, and welcome to another lecture on how to write a narrative poem, Part 2. This is a lecture from Dr. Jimmy Red, among others. This is meant to build on the first lecture that I've posted on how to write a narrative poem, and I invite you to watch that video before you watch this one. We're going to get a little more advanced in this video as to some things that can go on and should go on that a poet needs to pay attention to as he or she is writing a narrative poem. Among those things, we're going to look at imagery and in a little more detail. We're also going to talk about sound in a poem, because a poet is attentive to the sound of the poem as it is read aloud or in the mind's ear. And also we're going to talk a little bit about rhythm and form and structure. So getting a little more detailed into some elements that are particular to poetry, whereas the first lecture was focusing on some of the things and strengths that you might have already built if you're already a short story writer that can help you to begin to access poetry if you've never had experience before. So let's talk about imagery first off. I've already talked about imagery a little bit in the first lecture, but I want to make sure that we touch on this in a little further detail, because imagery is the life of a poem. Images can be thought of as pictures, or in the modern age, GIFs, tiny little videos. An image is anything that appeals to the five senses. So not just pictures and stuff, but as humans, we use our visual sense more than any other sense. Anything that appeals to all the five senses. The idea is images allow the reader to feel as if he or she is there, experiencing the poem or the event. In this case, you're writing a narrative as the speaker is. In a lyrical poem, you want to experience the emotion as the speaker is usually. So anything that appeals to sight, touch, taste, sound, or smell is an image. It's like in scene writing, whenever you're trying to write the scene as if the reader can visualize exactly what is happening as if they're watching through a camera, you're using imagery. You have to use imagery in scene writing and stories to allow the reader to visualize what's happening, but also to feel it in other ways. So I'm going to invite you to take a look at an example poem, Girl in the Doorway. It's on page 64 of Quit, and I've also posted a link there so you can view it online. So pull that up, and if you can, like make this video half size of your screen on one side, and then pull up the poem on the other half of your screen. Or if you can't, then either print it off or read it for a moment and then come back to this video. Pause this video and then read it for a moment. So I want to point out some particular images here. In the second line or so, there's a telephone cord trailing the hallway in tight curls. So that's a visual image. We can picture that telephone cord trailing the hallway in tight curls. If maybe you haven't seen a landline before, but some of those old landline phones had these curly lines that led to the telephone cord. Her voice is rising and falling on the telephone, so we can hear her voice rising and falling in that image right there. We also have another image later on in the poem. Her silver braces shine inside the velvet case of her mouth. So there's visual imagery there with her silver braces shining, but also there's touch, that velvet case of her mouth. So as a reader, you're invited to imagine, and a good reader of poetry who knows how to read poetry is already imagining that in his head, imagining the feel of velvet. And then later on we have a line that says, musk rises from the long crease in her bed, which is smell. So we can imagine the smell of this girl. So in each of these moments, we have all kinds of imagery, and I invite you to read through the poem. It is just chock full of images of this young girl. And all of these images have meaning. All of these images have implications. The telephone cord in tight curls is symbolic of how she's wrapped up in a tight curl, like almost as if she's got a lot of tension, and the implication is it's sexual tension. As she is getting into puberty here. Her voice rising and falling, her silver braces shining. So again and again, all of these elements have something to do with her growing into sexual maturity. So the interior music in the poem. Now let's talk a little bit about music in a poem, because one thing new people to poetry don't realize is that a poem is meant to be read aloud, either aloud to other people or in your mind's ear. You're supposed to imagine hearing it. So a lot of people know poetry, and they know roses are red, violets are blue, blah, 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 and they're used to those rhyming, those cute little sounding rhymes. And so, yeah, there are a lot of good poems that use perfect end rhymes very well. And I love perfect end rhyme if it's used well. But in my poetry classes, I like to challenge my readers with the narrative poem. And one way that I challenge my readers is I say, on this first assignment, I want you to try not to use perfect end rhyme. The reason is I want my writers to start trying some of the other types of sound in a poem, because I see a lot of beginning writers who will use perfect end rhyme but then ignore the other elements of sound within a poem. So that's a challenge. It's not that I hate perfect end rhyme. I actually, in the next poem, I have people write a lyrical poem. I ask them to use perfect end rhyme. So that's one of the challenges that I set up in this particular narrative poem. I want them to focus on the other elements of sound. So what are some of the other elements of sound that somebody can use in a poem? Assonance. That is the number one way a poet uses sound. And if you listen to rap or you listen to country music or any type of music, if you pay attention to it, you'll see that they are not just using rhyme, perfect end rhyme, that there is all kinds of elements of sound that drive us until we get to that rhyme at the end of a line. So assonance is the number one way we do that, and that's because we use vowels more than anything else in the English language. Assonance is the usage of repeated vowel sounds in a line. So if you read back through some of these poems, you'll see that poets are constantly using assonance, whether consciously or not. Consonance is the other way, repeated consonant sounds. It's a great way to use sound. One of the beginning ways that people start trying to use this is by alliteration or consonants at the very beginning of a word. But then I challenge my students to start trying alliteration in the middle of not alliteration, consonants in the middle of a word or at the end of a word, so rich or partial consonants. Using a variety of these types of techniques available to you proves to me that you've read the book, that you have listened to the video lectures, and that you are playing with all of the things in the poet's toolbox, that you're capable of employing all of those things, which pushes you further toward an A. Internal rhyme instead of all lines ending in rhyme. If you put a rhyme in the middle of a line, that can surprise a reader. And so I invite folks to try doing that. Or you, instead of having a hard rhyme at the end of a line, you can use enjambment at the end of a line so that the rhyme's not emphasized. So it doesn't sound like a nursery rhyme, in other words. So other types of sound that a poet can use is slant rhyme, I rhyme, other types of rhyme. These are more subtle ways to make music, and a good poet can incorporate all of these into her musical box. And that's really what I'm looking for as you write your poem. And as my students write their poems, I'm looking for them to be able to employ all of these elements to show to me that they can use them all. Other types are anaphora. This is where you begin the beginning of a line with the same phrase, and that pushes us forward like a good preacher does a lot of times. Diction, that's word choice. Sentence grace. So eliminating unnecessary words, being concise, choosing strong words, demonstrating the power of your vocabulary without trying to sound like you are condescending toward the reader. Let's take a look at how Girl in the Doorway uses this again. So we have an instance of assonance in the line, close telephone cord. See those 3 O sounds? It's a closed telephone cord. So this is assonance that in 3 words in a row pushes us forward, is very attentive to sound. Or repeated hard consonants, for instance, or soft consonants. Note in that same line, closed telephone cord. There's lots of hard consonants right there that emphasize how closed it is. Enjambment and slant rhyme in My Papa's Waltz. If you don't know what that is, take a look at how My Papa's Waltz uses enjambment and slant rhyme here instead of just perfect in rhyme, although I do have an example of perfect in rhyme. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. So the words wrist and missed is slant rhyme. So that's allowed in the poem. If you can use slant rhyme, that would be great. You can also use perfect rhyme, okay, like knuckle and buckle. But the challenge that I set before the poem is don't use it at the end of the line. So you could put that, instead of as Retke does in this poem right here, you could slam knuckle into the middle of another line or something like that. And that would keep it from being perfect in rhyme. But, of course, this poem was written purposefully and intentionally in a certain way. And that enjambment at the end de-emphasizes the line. It would sound real slim, sing-songy if every single line was in-stopped and also perfectly in-rhymed. So now let's talk a little bit about line breaks. So this is one of the most common things that students ask me who are trying to begin to learn about how to write poetry. How do I decide when to break my line? Chapter 21 of Quit does an excellent job of talking about different ways in which poets decide to break a line if it is an unrhymed and unmetrical verse. So, I mean, let's say you're not writing iambic pentameter. You have no idea what I'm talking about when I say iambic pentameter, and you're writing a free verse poem. Even free verse poets are breaking a line for a reason almost 90% of the time. They choose to break the line for a certain reason, or maybe they have an instinct about where to break the line. So how do you decide to break a line? And good poets are constantly making decisions about every aspect, about every word, about every way the poem is formatted as they write it. And they definitely make decisions about where to break the line. The question of how you want the poem to sound will often determine where you break the lines, or to some extent your line breaks act as a part of the poem's musical notation. And, you know, I'm a musician, so when I think about writing poetry, I think about music as well. So the line breaks can determine pauses and tension and emphasis and pace. Although whenever you read a poem, you're not supposed to stop at the end of a line when you're reading it, if there's not punctuation there usually. But that they will help create like a little breath, a little space. Sometimes they create tension, or they'll create emphasis and pace. They can also determine your content and meaning. In another sense, They can look visually appealing on the page. A poem that's like got lines that go out forever and then it's got a bunch of short clipped lines. Sometimes that looks like the poet doesn't know what he or she is doing, although I can think of instances where that worked. Kowit outlines 13 different reasons poets typically decide to break a line. I recommend, and I want to see from my students' poems, that they try a variety of these line break choices in their poem, and I'm going to outline a few in the coming slides. So one of the things that Kowit says is you could break a line at the end of a sentence or a phrase unit. Okay, this is the most common first thing I see students do is they break a line at the end of a sentence or a phrase unit. So phrase unit, that means like after a dependent clause or after an independent clause, for instance. But you don't want to do that for every line because then that can get real boring. Okay, I want you to try other elements as well. So you can break for pace or a sense of unbroken flow. One works against this principle of ending at the end of a natural phrase unit. So this is the opposite of number one right here. If you want to create a different pace or get a sense of unbroken flow, you can't enjam a line ending in the middle of a phrase unit. If you do that, it forces the reader to move on. They're like, wait, there's something incomplete here, and they want to read on to the next line. Number three, you can put special emphasis to a word or phrase at the end of a line. So you can end a line to emphasize the word at the end of the line to make it stand out. Or does the poem feel like it's tight, tense, or compressed in content? Maybe try shorter lines. So you could try writing a poem that's mostly shorter lines if it's compressed or tense. Or if it's got a big spirit, if the person's got a lot to say, you might try using longer lines, like Whitman, for instance. You might break to create surprise or irony. You might break to create a certain visual image on the page. I've seen poems that were constructed to look like swans or altars where somebody would come down and repent. You might try anaphoric verse like Walt Whitman. You might break to mask a rhyme. So like I was talking about earlier, create internal rhyme instead of perfect end rhyme. You might try to create suspense or tension. So rhythm. This is probably for folks the hardest thing for them to begin to understand. So this is the way that I try to explain it to them, and I've had a lot of success in the past explaining to students how a poem uses rhythm. A poem is meant to be read aloud, so a poet needs to be attentive to its rhythm. The easiest way to begin thinking about rhythm, for me at least, is first off, think about this. If you're new to poetry, the punctuation you put in the poem creates pauses to break up the rhythm. The words you choose and the order you put them in and what syllables are typically accented in the words creates rhythm too. So the words you choose and the order you put them in create rhythm. Because whenever you're writing a sentence, you could put those words in different ways, and whenever you said them out loud, you would naturally emphasize words in a different way. And then what syllables are typically accented in the words create rhythm too. So you probably know what a syllable is. The word syllable has 3 syllables, syllable. And natural accents go on different syllables in that word syllable. I'm putting an accent on syllable, on the first and the last syllables in syllable, and there's less accent on the middle. Just to give you an example. Of course, different words and where they're placed creates different accents. Now, what the heck does that all mean? uh, think about music, okay? Music has natural accents, okay, as you're singing a song, okay? Uh, and you can use pauses or rests in music to stop. And uh, punctuation in a poem is like a caesura in music, or a moment where you're supposed to pause, where there's not supposed to be any music there. And so that's the first way you create rhythm, is by understanding where the pauses go in your poem. So for this one, we're going to think about word choice and word order. The order in which you place the words and the places where the accents normally fall create a rhythm. Check a dictionary if you don't know where the rhythm typically falls in a word. This is the beat of the word. Now, this is where I'm able to start beginning to get across to students. Think about music. In music, there's an upbeat and a downbeat. This is where the word gets emphasis and where it doesn't typically. Just like a song, a well-constructed poem has a regular rhythm. Usually this happens by placing a beat or accent on every other syllable. The most common rhythm is called iambic, which emphasizes every second syllable. And the second most common is trochaic, which emphasizes every first syllable. So I like to sing Amazing Grace to get folks to think about what iambic meter sounds like in a song. That's, again, putting the beat on every second syllable. That's the most common way that poets write. So let me sing it for you. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once. So you hear how I'm emphasizing every second syllable? That's iambic meter, okay? That's what's happening in a poem. If you just saw Amazing Grace on the page as if it was written as a poem, it would be an iambic meter because every second syllable would be emphasized. So if you read through a poem and you write a poem and you want to try to write it in iambic, emphasizing every second syllable, try to see if it fits to Amazing Grace right there. The second most common regular rhythm of a poem is the Battle Hymn of a Republic, and that's trochaic meter. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. So that puts the emphasis on every first syllable. So just like music, in 4/4 right there, every two beats get emphasized. In 4/4, you get an emphasis on the first and third beat there. Or you might try to emphasize the upbeat on the second and fourth beats there. So see which one fits your poem right there. Thinking about form and structure. Although we won't be working with a classic form or structure in our narrative poem, it's worth thinking about how your poem is organized. Lines and stanzas are the most basic units of structure in a poem, and I've already talked about some strategies for stanzas in a previous lecture, but think about stuff you've learned in story writing. So some of the things you can think about. What scene goes where? Okay, so if you're telling a story in a poem, what scene, if you've got 3 scenes, how do you want to organize those scenes in your poem? Do you want to tell the story chronologically, or do you need a flashback and then you're going to come back to the present at some point? Where does the climax in the poem belong? How can I organize the poem to emphasize the rising conflict? All of the same questions you made when you were trying to determine the structure of your story can apply when you're trying to determine the structure of your poem. So, my friends, I want to emphasize some of the things that we've been talking about. We've been talking about line breaks and rhythm and sound and form and structure. in a piece of poetry. I want to emphasize, like I did in the last lecture, that the key thing in writing a narrative poem is just basically getting the show don't tell specifics of the story on the page. That way we can visualize and experience and understand what is happening in the poem. That's the first challenge I have to get students to overcome to write a good narrative poem, is that using specific details, show don't tell. That gets them to a B. And the next step is the stuff I'm talking about in this particular lecture. Beginning to make decisions about line breaks, using some of those 13 techniques that I outlined in this lecture. Getting to make decisions about sound, using some of those techniques that I've outlined in this lecture right here, showing to me that you can use assonance and consonants and internal rhyme and not just use perfect end rhyme at the end of every line, and not just using end stopping at the end of every line. Varying your techniques, showing me you can use all of the different tools in the poet's toolbox. And then about rhythm. Again, that's the hardest element to begin to learn to master as a poet. And so I'm very lenient on grading when it comes to that. But I do want you to start thinking about these things, and I want you to be attentive to rhythm in your lines. One of the most easy ways to be thinking about that is, where am I putting my pauses? Do some of the lines seem to go longer without a pause, and then some of them go shorter without a pause? I think that's one of the first ways to start thinking about rhythm. And then start thinking about rhythm as you're a songwriter and stuff like that. And then about sound as well. Keep all of that in mind. Oh, or I said also form and structure. So, my friends, that's about all I have to say today. I really hope that you have fun writing your poems. That's the main thing. My job is to teach you about all the tools available to you, and I want to see you play with these tools. Have fun with experimenting with some of these other tools. One of the pushbacks that I have about the assignment that I give and it not allowing perfect end rhyme is that you're cramping my style. But if you've written so many poems ending in perfect end rhyme only, I'm trying to challenge you to try to use some other stuff out there. And if you start doing that, I promise you, you'll have a lot more fun with your poems as you go forward. And that's the key element in poetry writing, is play. And I want you to play with all of these different things in the artist's toolbox. Show me that you can use them. Okay, my friend, until next time, I hope you all have a good day, and I wish you all peace, love, and understanding.